Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our little go live here. My name is Chris Burtonshaw. I am founder and CEO of Strata Security, and I'm here to talk to you today about effectively how we're going to navigate the fact that we've achieved the milestone of having over 100 new vulnerabilities released every day as CVEs in 2024. And I'm really lucky to have been joined today by Anthony Harrison, who is founder of APH10 and also one of Europe or possibly the world's authorities on software bill of materials and software supply chain. Thanks for joining us, Anthony.
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much. Yes, maybe I'm not quite. I'm not the world. Just I might make a lot of noise on LinkedIn about them. But yeah, there's other people who are far more experienced in.
Well, anyway, what I think we should be doing is talking about how on earth we got to this position. So I don't know if anyone saw. There's a little comment on the live stream earlier, but over the weekend, some data was crunched by those with better data in front of them, and it seems that we had over 36,500 vulnerabilities up till the 1st of December, which is a huge milestone. I think that's 20 or 30% above.
Yeah, we were about the high 20,000s last year. So yeah, so it's there's a few reasons why there's more this year, but I think those reasons don't account for all of the increases.
Indeed, yes. So probably what I should say is we're live on LinkedIn here. So anybody got any comments or questions? I'm going to go through through our agenda in a minute, but ultimately any comments, just put them in the chat and we'll try and respond. We don't have a technical person helping us, so apologies if there's a little bit of a delay there. Anyway, but looking forward to everybody's contributions. So as I said, we've got an agenda. We do love a slide. So effectively what we're going to try and talk about over the next 40 minutes or so is how we got to this 36,000, the kind of struggles that we're going to be seeing with this volume, and also, more importantly, as the original text of the meeting asked, is how can we adapt? There are a lot of approaches that people have adopted over the years to manage their vulnerabilities. What are those and how they need to change? And then finally, any questions, so either through the chat or send us a DM or whatever. And it'd be great to get some of your questions from the audience.
So I think it's interesting to say how we got there, 36,000. I think there could be several reasons. One is that there's about 400 different organisations who can declare a vulnerability, and there's obviously the number of organisations who are eligible to do that has increased. One of the big ones was the Linux kernel became what we call a CNA, and so they've and you can understand any vulnerability in the Linux kernel is probably quite crucial. So therefore, I think they've had about 3,000 this year. Mm-hmm. But I think the other thing you could also say is a lot of these vulnerabilities are found by researchers who are paid to find weaknesses, which is great. Yes. But are they getting a little bit of help? Are they getting a little bit of help from the little thing called AI? And is that really helping, or is that really hindering us? Is it really finding true problems? Or is it just finding potential issues that an AI engine can detect, but actually are never going to be reasonable in the context of the software is actually deployed, because AI is just looking at it bare, whereas the researchers, at least they're looking at it probably on some equipment, so at least they can see, well, okay, this is running on an embedded IoT device, so therefore there are certain challenges in terms of whether that vulnerability is going to appear or not. So that, I think, is an interesting thing, is do you think we've got so many because we've now got an army of automatic researchers who are just throwing stuff out and actually hindering the industry rather than helping the industry. So I don't know what you think, Chris.
Well, yeah, I was going to say there's certainly an element of that, but also then on the other side, we've got more applications that we're protecting than ever before, right? Everyone talks about, legacy. I personally don't like using that word because today's modern is tomorrow's legacy, and the gap between the two I feel is shortening, or I've noticed that in my career. So we've got organisations that are potentially managing a whole fleet of SaaS products that they're using in their day-to-day work, but also there's all of the applications that are running on-premise, in servers, on their endpoints, on their devices. So I think the software complexity of your average organization has gone up so much, as well as perhaps the motivations of people to both detect and report upon vulnerabilities, because of course we've got things like bug bounties, which are, as you mentioned, encouraging people to find these things, right, and publish them, of course.
Yeah, and I think also there's a sort of the drive to deliver functionality quickly. People tend to maybe rush. I think, as you say, complexity of software is just growing exponentially. People are driven by demands to try and get their product out there quickly, meet milestones, etc. And maybe we're not spending enough time testing to ensure that these weaknesses are there. I mean, a lot of these weaknesses are not trivial to find. It's not like divide by zero, which is probably one of the first things you often find when you coding 101. But some of these are the conditions for the vulnerabilities can be predicted in quite a lot of cases, and a lot of them seem to be related to data input. Defining what data input is obviously not always, it's not just a user sitting at a keyboard and typing it. This can be coming down networks, it can be down all sorts of other ways, APIs. So I think it is quite interesting. I think it's a wake up call. I think 30,000 is a wake up call. I think I like these wake up calls.
I was going to say it's 36,000 and December ain't over yet.
No, exactly. Yeah, and I think as we saw today, there was the NCSC in the UK. We produced their annual report. I haven't read it. I very quickly just did a scan, and the word vulnerability appears 37 times. So it's nearly 36,000. But yeah, so the word vulnerability is very much needs to be front and center of anybody doing cybersecurity these days.
Yeah. And I remember in a previous role, I used to browse, and this probably ages me a little bit, Security Focus every week, looking at all the new stuff across the relatively simple stacks that we were looking at the time. And of course, that works when there might be, let's say, 10 a month. When we're at this sort of 100 a day sort of volume, it's really not sustainable and scalable, is it?
No. I think we probably need to define what we mean by a vulnerability, just to sort of make it clear.
Yes.
Because then that, I think, will then going to help us towards the question we want to address.
Yes.
But I think a vulnerability is a reported weakness, I suppose, is the best definition. Where somebody has found a condition where something happens that is probably not desirable.
Yep.
And it may be a very specific conditions, like and we're gonna get one like in 2038 when the clock goes on, 32-bit clock goes over. We can predict that, so we can mitigate that. But sometimes you can't predict. Well, someone's going to put a set of data in, and it's a particular obscure format, and someone's found put a funny character in and things like that, and your data validation has failed. So something,
and of course, it could be that data validation was looked at the beginning and somebody found some SQL injection, then they fixed that, and then now we're coming down the track and someone's found something exotic to do with, I don't know, cross-site scripting reflection or something like that.
Yeah, and I think, you think a lot of the thing, the consequence of the vulnerability, it could lead to an exploit, and that exploit could then lead to something like a data breach or a ransomware attack, which is where governments are now particularly concerned. They want to protect their citizens from these nasty attacks that often are, you've got armies of people trying to find these weaknesses and sending phishing email campaigns, etc. So that's what the vulnerability in its own right isn't dangerous. It could be used by others to make it dangerous.
Yes, indeed. And I guess that's I guess framing the question here is we've talked about what the vulnerability is, and I guess we probably need to come down onto what sort of struggles that we're seeing, right?
So I think the first thing is you get a vulnerability and it says it's in a component X. Well, the first question you got to know is, are you using that component X?
Of course, yeah.
And that's often is, and we saw that a few years ago with Log4Shell. Well, people a large Java library that many people were using, but they didn't know it was in their stack because it was being embedded by others who had built their applications and libraries. And, people were shocked at I didn't know I was using that.
And that was a fun pre-Christmas for many of us, I'm sure, that are watching.
Very educational Christmas, is the way I look at it.
Very educational. And in that specific case, I was really interested because it sort of brought a lot of stuff to the forefront about what particular cloud services we're using, for example.
Yes.
There was a lot of software publishing that they were vulnerable, and you're like, oh, really? And you looked at some of the criteria, and you think, actually, hang on a minute. That kind of says that not only were they vulnerable, but also they weren't restricting their outbound internet access, for example. Yeah. So a lot of change has happened in the last 5 years.
I hope a lot of change has happened. Yeah, because I don't know if we have another Log4Shell, will people be able to respond in a far more proactive way than cancel Christmas? So I think what you've got to first of all is understand those components. Do you have that inventory of components, and do you know how up to date those components are? Are they maintained? Are they full of vulnerabilities, or have they been upgraded?
Yeah.
So you need to have that inventory of components, and it needs to go quite deep. So it's not necessarily just the components your dev team may be using. You need to understand what components that they're using have been brought in behind the backs almost. And the the best analogy I use is think about a burger. A burger is obviously a set of products. Your burger bun, your meat, your salad, etc. They've come from various parts of the supply chain, and then they get assembled by your restaurant. Do you know all those supply chains? So yeah. And and ultimately, you've then got to ask those questions. Bread, is it gluten free potentially? Because if it's not, then you may have an allergic reaction. You assume it's going to be fresh ingredients for your salad? Yeah. So the analogy for software, fresh software, is it up to date software?
And also, amusingly, many of the burger companies are very good at publishing what's in their burgers these days, perhaps compared to 10, 15 years ago, and perhaps they're further ahead than some software places.
I think I can see where we're going now. Yes, exactly. So the burger things that's why you go to a shop or restaurant, they say, are you allergic? They make things very public.
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing that for software? I think we know it says no. So one of the things is that I think following from the Log4Shell and other incidents, I think we need to document all the components that we use, and we need to go deep dive. So we need, in the burger, go back to the burger, you want to know what's in the meat and where the meat's also come from, all the way down that supply chain. Not just come from the butcher. You need to understand all the way down, almost back to Littlefield, that the cow was munching his grass in. That's quite onerous, and I don't think many people have got that yet. But that's the way we need to go to, because increasingly that gives people assurance that basically, if you understand your supply chain, you can manage your supply chain. You can understand where the risks are coming upstream and downstream if you're passing that on to your customers.
And I think that's kind of where there's a huge opportunity that I'd actually perhaps like to work with you more on, Anthony, actually in the future, around turning the reactive into proactive.
Yes.
Because what we see, effectively, to summarize really quickly, is a lot of data from scanners, right? And that's great because it tells you that there is, for example, a vulnerability today in that particular platform. However, when you start to look at the supply chain, and you've got, let's say we do some scans, we discover we've got application X or application Y, there's a real opportunity to start looking ahead, documenting that you've got application and components X, Y, Z, and then knowing in the future when these things come up that potentially you can do something before it's in the next scan.
Yes, and and I've often done an audit, go into saying, generate that data, show them where what that data is showing them, the analysis of that data, and saying, okay, today you're okay. Well, you need to do this tomorrow and the day after because new vulnerabilities are coming all the time, and you need to then understand what those risks are and make risk judgments based on your context and your business imperatives. And what the documentation is really important is documenting that in a standard format. I found lots of people will just have a spreadsheet, and we all know spreadsheets are brilliant little tools, but they also don't look after themselves. And so therefore, if you often ask, you say maybe your dev team, your architects, they'll say this is all we're using. Well, why do we want to rely on a human to do it? We need to get tooling to actually do this, and they can go a lot deeper and they will find all the components. Particularly, it's the unknown unknowns, which is really where I think the value is, because a lot of these vulnerabilities are in these hidden, what we'll call hidden dependencies that people didn't know about. I didn't know.
And change over time as well, right?
Yes.
So you put a calendar component in your product. You load all those libraries in, and then 6 months down the line, that particular library changes how it renders, and you've got a whole different. I mean, in this case, front end probably less significant, but it brings in a whole extra load of sub libraries that maybe, unless you're on the ball, you weren't keeping track of.
Yeah, and I think I often hear the answer. The 20-line JavaScript application you can do becomes a 200,000 line thing because of all the things that comes in. And what that means is you haven't got a 20-line program with an attack surface. You've got an attack surface of 200,000 lines of code. Any one of those 200,000 lines could be the weakness that somebody could find a way as a way of entry point into your organization or to your applications, and then away they go. That's where those vulnerabilities are, not in your 20 lines of code. It's the components that you brought in. And that's why we need things like software bill of materials to be developed and maintained. So you need to create them on, maybe as part of your development pipeline, build an SBOM regularly, and then what I call curate it. You need to look at it. It's not something you just say it's a one-off, put it in the filing cabinet, if you ever got a filing cabinet, the virtual electronic filing cabinet.
I think I prefer the manual ones, to be honest.
Yeah, well, yeah. You need to do a little bit more. But the beauty of SBOMs is the standard. There are formats, number of good standard formats, Cyclone DX or SPDX. And because they've been designed to be machine readable, they're great for passing into other tools. So therefore, you can then extract key data points out of it, because everyone will have a different view. Chris and myself, we'll have different viewpoints in terms of what we would want to look at, wouldn't we?
Oh, absolutely. So it's all got to be risk driven, and risk is highly contextual, and risk based on assessing your risk to your organization is one perspective, but also if you have, let's say, 5 person days available for reducing your level of vulnerability or your level of risk, you want to prioritize that to giving you the biggest bang for buck, right? And it might be that the most severe vulnerability isn't the vulnerability that's actually exposing you to the most risk.
Yes, and I think that comes down to you've got to be doing this on a regular basis. It's not I've seen lots of people where we end of a development life cycle. That's like let's go and do some pen testing, and you're going to get some observations if you don't get an observations, pen testing
Scans,
probably
of
hasn't done
course.
the job, because
Yeah.
you're always going to find something.
Mm.
But you don't think, okay, I've done my pen testing, like Steve Siver lead, nothing happens for the next 12 months, so my next pen test. You need to be doing this on a continually basis. And that's the concern, is because that's work, that's a resource load. How do you then manage that resource load such that it's manageable by all sizes of businesses?
Absolutely. And one thing I would add in is that we've actually got increasing visibility of instances of vulnerabilities today. I know perhaps in some in some areas of the supply chain, I suspect it's very limited, as we've spoken about. But if you look at like your average enterprise, they've got scanners. Increasingly, endpoint protection tools are bringing vulnerability capability into the platform. So in a way, in some areas we are actually better informed than ever.
Mm-hmm.
However, we do still have these huge blind spots.
And ultimately, it's the bad news press as well sometimes, because you got another one and another one, and I think what we're also seeing is outside the regulators are now starting to see, well, are you delivering a high quality product, and are you maintaining the quality of that product? Are you having a product that's full of holes?
Mm-hmm.
And we're starting to, with security issues, open passwords, etc. We're now starting to see the regulators tightening down on that and requiring, putting the onus on the product manufacturers rather than relying on the consumer to be the one who actually locks all the device down. Actually, it's got to be secure by default, secure by design, and I don't know how you do this. But vulnerabilities, free of vulnerabilities, because I've never written vulnerability-free software. I've tried, but I've never, I can't guarantee that, hands on heart, that basically my software is not full of any bugs. And what I can probably do is I can probably assess my software to say, although there may be a vulnerability in a component I'm using, it is not exploitable because of the other protections that my product lives in. Maybe it's behind a big firewall, or the way the exploit or the vulnerability.
I've got a story there from Log4j, actually. During that period, there was a lot of detections of Log4j, and everyone was, releasing their own scanning tool, and obviously existing scans were being updated continuously to find this new threat. And one of the issues was explaining why something wasn't vulnerable.
Right.
For example, if many of them were just detecting the presence of the library, and of course, if that piece of software isn't being actively used, then it isn't exploitable in perhaps the same way as if it was running on a as part of a server application that was potentially compromised as part of just a request to it.
And that's a great segue, because I think a lot of the scanners are quite simple, and they have to be, because they don't have all the information. They don't have the context. They don't understand necessarily that you're not internet facing. And if you are internet facing, your risk is far different than if you're just internally facing. That needs the human in the loop to actually do that triage, to say, it's okay, it's a vulnerability, but actually it's only available, a direct attack coming from an open cloud base. But what you also need to do is you need to share that as well. And that is what you need to say. I have done that assessment. The vulnerable function that's in this component that's being reported as a vulnerability, I'm not using it. So we're all right today.
Indeed, yeah.
But then, you've got to keep mind that, okay, if your dev team then adds a new feature and uses that new vulnerable function, then you are vulnerable. So you've got to, you've got to keep track of your dev team and the way they're doing feature updates as well. So
very interesting. We had a couple of comments in the meantime.
Okay, good. Before I was about to move on to prioritization, but let's see those comments.
Yeah, well, a comment from Brent here about the increase in detected vulnerabilities. Effectively saying also that we've got more detection mechanisms. So, for example, SAS, DAST code composition. So we're also surfacing, we're also doing more, I think, as an industry, around trying to detect those things early and working on it. So I think there's some good movement overall in the industry.
Well, there's also then the downside of them is how accurate are they? Because we've got there's a false positives or false negatives, and I've done some reviews of products that you put the same application and you get different answers. So what's the point of truth? And that sometimes is quite difficult. So sometimes you've got to just look at them and you maybe combine the data and say, well, it's somewhere in between possibly. So it's just software, these tools anyway. So as we know, software's not perfect.
We definitely should be collaborating on the, I'm going to call it preemptive supply chain.
Yes, it's yes. And I think we have very much a find and fix mentality, which was Log4Shell. That was find it and then fix it. That's the reactive. We need to go to protect and predict,
absolutely,
which is a more proactive approach. And we need to, but that requires investment in understanding your product and how your products are being put together, such you can then be ahead of the game. Because ultimately, it's a race. If you have a vulnerability and then somebody wants to generate an exploit, then basically that period of time used to be a month. It's probably 15 days longer now because they've got AI writing code for them.
Hopefully.
And it might be even quicker.
Well, hopefully not in this case. I don't know.
Yeah.
Selective AI, hopefully.
Yeah. So what you've got to think about is that there are the number of techniques that people have traditionally used for trying to prioritize it, because you're going to get data overload, too much data. So you have to then come up with some criteria.
Absolutely, and to talk about like how things might have worked up to now, and I say now quite loosely, people might have said, right, in terms of, let's say, vulnerabilities that have been detected on my network through scanning or through agents or whatever, I am going to patch or fix those that are high or critical on the CVSS score, maybe within, a certain number of working days, maybe 14. And of course, we've got a good old Cyber Essentials, which is saying that we're going to be patching everything within 14 days of patch release as well. So ultimately, I think in a world where there are at least 36,500 vulnerabilities a year, possibly even more, given we're only in December, and just in December, and also potentially CVSS, which we should come to in a second, that's what? Between 5 and 10 times more stuff to patch every year than before.
Yes, and I think so. CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, is quite an old system, and it's a bit of a metrics. It's looking at various attributes in terms of is it a network? Does it require a user? Does it affect data type of impact?
Is it exfiltration, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I think the people that you need to realise is the people that score is calculated with very little knowledge of the software.
Yes.
And it's often worst case. And so what you often have to see is when the CVSS is calculated by, it is, I think, a human generated generally. But if you look at compare it with, say, a vendor who's got the same product, and they will look at the same vulnerability and they will give you a different score, that's because they've got more insights in than the original thing. So if you say, always, take a score, let's say 9, which is CVSS version 3 critical score, you're going to get quite a number of potential vulnerabilities, because what we're seeing is over time vulnerabilities are getting more severe, and actually
it wasn't just me that thought that.
No, so there's more high and critical growing over time. I don't whether that's because they're harder to find, so therefore when they do find, they have a bigger impact. I don't know. So what you often find is you find some of the tools will actually recategorize a vulnerability score. So if you do it on a critical score for the raw CVSS score, as against from a categorized one by a tool that's got a little bit more insights, you will probably get different results, probably more manageable. But what you may find is they may also promote vulnerabilities that were previously high, they think these are more critical than the ones that are marked critical, and actually you can downplay them then to high or even medium.
Well, I can give you some specifics there. Again, talking about the kind of the scanned and detected vulnerabilities in an environment live, as opposed to through supply chain evaluation. We're doing a lot of prioritization around the asset value or criticality combined with the CVSS score ultimately. And again, there are more 9s and 10s than there ever were. Sorry, 8s, 9s, and 10s than there ever were. And then finally, the other thing is how exposed that particular asset is, which is a really interesting one, because of course that's not really included in any of those metrics. And then finally, we don't want to be spending too much time worrying about vulnerabilities that are going to be patched as part of our normal cycle anyway. So, for example, if we know that a server is getting regular patches and we've scanned it before those patches have been applied, we can either potentially expedite that, but ultimately we don't want to be panicking about something that's about to happen. So,
and I think what you have to do is you've got to have a strategy, and CVSS is a classic metrics. It's easy to do. Just load the data into your spreadsheet, filter, boom, and you're not going to go wrong, but I think you're going to get a lot of work.
Yes.
What I have found is by trying to look at it from a more risk-based rather than a metrics-based approach, because what we find is a lot of those vulnerabilities can never really be exploited in reality. Various figures say 95% of them are ideally, only going to be exposed in a particular circumstance, typically in a lab environment. So to be able to actually say, well, is this actually like to see the real world? Then can we find the 95% that we can discount? So we only focus on the 5%.
Exactly.
That's really where we need to get to. And there are now various mechanisms to do that, but that requires a risk-based approach, and it needs people to actually ask for a risk-based approach, not put in a contract, fix all the critical ones.
Yeah, we had another comment in the meantime from Mark. So effectively, we've now got an unachievable vulnerability management and patching targets here, really.
Yes.
Severity X in time window Y just has a sad face. I mean, that's just not going to work. So, I mean, here's a question, and Mark saying, should we argue for context and risk-based here?
Yes. Definitely.
What does that look like? And I think it's going to be interesting because there's a lot of opportunity given the amount of data we've got now.
So I think the industry is starting to wake up to realise that we have this vulnerability overload, which I think is 100 CVEs is really, I think now says wake up. So I think what you need to look at is look at the context and look at what's happening in the real world. So if somebody is actively exploiting a vulnerability to cause mayhem, then that's probably you need to probably fix that and make sure you don't become a victim. So there are, and this is some of this data is publicly available. You don't have to be spending thousands of pounds on these expensive tools. There is a list of known exploited vulnerabilities that is publicly updated I see it nearly every day now.
I think it is every day.
It is known as the KEV, the key exploited or known exploited vulnerabilities, and that is a minimum. That's about 1,200 vulnerabilities out of the 250,000 that vulnerabilities they've ever reported, and they've seen in the field people using those. So if you have a component with the vulnerability that's on that list, fix it. And that's, you're going to reduce your risk exposure quite quickly by just doing those. Then sort of the next phase to that is to say, well, what's the probability that a new vulnerability is going to get exploited in the next month? And that's something that's where the data, so there's an AI model that is used, that runs every night, and it tries to predict based on the threat intel they're covering from the world of industry. And is it predicting the likelihood of probability? And that's what you call EPSS. And if you can look at EPSS, and you can put quite a small threshold, maybe it's a 10% chance that this exploit could actually lead to something exploitable. Actually, if you filtered on that, you'll find there's a lot of vulnerabilities won't even meet that threshold because some of them are just not exciting. They're going to focus on the software where it's mostly used, so your browsers, because they've got a bigger set of their victims.
Yes.
And
we're seeing that as well. Is that exploitable vulnerabilities? So many of them are browser and end user compute, and again contributing towards that. How the hell do we manage this kind of question?
Yeah, and obviously, depends on where you are in your dev cycle. Obviously, focus on the ones that are actually out in the customer that you've actually shipped or using in production.
Yes.
And it doesn't say don't look at the ones that you're in development, but maybe you've got to prioritize the production ones over the development ones again, because you've got a finite resource of engineers to do the fixes. And the final one I would also add is about technical debt. Monitor about your technical debt, because although your software, and I've had a wonderful comment that somebody gave me a couple of weeks ago. Software is not like wine. Software gets worse over time, unlike wine. And I love that. So you need to look after your software. Just because it's not vulnerable doesn't mean it's not going to get hard to update it in a moment, 6 months' time. So don't let it become too out of date. Even if it's vulnerable free, don't let it become too out of date. Because when you're going from maybe a major release, going from a version 3 to a version 4, that could be quite a big jump. And you don't want that suddenly to be, and then you're having to spend valuable resource, almost re-engineering your product. Whereas if you've been doing it, every couple of months, keeping your software reasonably up to date, you won't have that big.
And it's exactly the same with infrastructure type vulnerabilities.
And infrastructure is especially that. Yes.
Yeah. It's much easier to keep applying the regular patches from, let's say, your switch and network provider than it is to have to jump at short notice.
But it's not just patches; it's actually keeping software featured because what you find, particularly in the open source components, people don't maintain the later version. They don't, unless you've got a particular support thing, they'll say, "Well, I'm now on version 2.24. Well, what do you mean you're still using 2.23? Yeah, and that's you need to be aware of that, keep track of that, and that I think is something we need as an industry to understand a bit more about how we support open source communities, because particularly if you rely on open source for your critical infrastructure, are you supporting that team that's delivering that component? Most of those open source components are delivered by volunteers because they like writing software.
And perhaps less keen on patching.
And less keen on patching and less keen on process. Well, they don't mind patching sometimes. They like finding faults, fixing faults, but they might not like process. And that is where the regulators are starting to get really interested. They want to see a lot more process. And that's where things like Cyber Resilience Act, which is coming to Europe, it will get, I think, Act next week. And that's going to affect anybody selling a digital product into the EU.
And of course, not quite this, but obviously PCI DSS4 touches on obviously the control of your effectively your script stack from your website and things like that, and anything referring onto the payment gateway as well. So there is lots of increased regulation coming.
Yeah, and this is all about increased transparency. So whereas you think security, you need to be all very tight and don't expose anything. True. Yeah, but actually you need to be more open and transparent to understand what your challenges are. And if you've got the challenges, there will be people who can help you.
Absolutely. Right. Well, we're almost getting towards the point where we've got a few questions, so we probably should switch towards that.
Yes.
Anything else to cover just before I put that slide back up?
No, I think we've got to sort of potentially, we've got the problem. I think we've got potential ways of looking at a way out.
Absolutely. Well, we got to that point where we just thought, asking a question. Some of you have been entering bits into the chat, so thank you very much for that. If you've got any more, please do pop them in. We had another question here around from Brent here should we be routinely including the detection of attack paths into our vulnerability management tooling? Now, that's a really interesting one. In fact, I was talking about that earlier today with somebody, understanding, if a vulnerability, again, on like a network device or whatever pops up, at what point can we deprioritize those that have no impact and aren't accessible?
And that is, yes, and I will also look at that as a reachability as well, software reachability. So if you look at your software, and I'm trying to, a little project I'm trying to do is trying to look at that. So what's your entry point into a module? Can you work out how you get to a particular function?
Yes.
Because ultimately what we have is we actually have vulnerable functions within a vulnerable component. But actually everyone just talks about the vulnerable component. And really we need to get down to that, a finer granularity to say, are you using that vulnerable function?
Yes.
I have something that I'm sort of working on that's trying to help with that. It's early stages. It's quite hard. And if it wasn't hard, there'd be lots of products already out there trying to do this.
Interesting.
So it is trying to work that out, and it's going to be difficult. I know it's difficult because I haven't solved it. But yeah, trying to find that thing, and as you say, the path is another way of doing it. That generally is a slightly higher level component. But yeah. I suppose I agree with what Brent just said there.
Yeah, and then the final thing I was going to say was that I think from a sort of a systems and infrastructure and software, say Windows, Linux vulnerability perspective, I think that could turn. So one with all the things we talked about before with prioritization, as in removing those that are going to be regularly patched anyway from your kind of panic list, looking at the combination of the CVSS, the exploitability, and the criticality or value of the affected asset or assets, and the number of them may be, do we have a further opportunity to turn it from maybe focusing on 10% of the vulnerabilities to focusing on 5%? Because of course that could cut it really right down if you can bring in that context.
Yeah, and I think businesses have got to see is this going to be an opportunity they can say if they can demonstrate to their customers where they are. So I've certainly spoken to people where they've been evaluating a product and they've said, can you give me your SBOM and the status of the vulnerabilities in the SBOM? And if your product manufacturer says, and what format would you like? I would be happy boys. Yes, because they understand it. If you say, how do I do that? Well, that just might start getting question, okay, do we need to think about are they actually following good best practices?
No, that's very good. Okay, well, if any more pop in, I'll probably just sort of raise those again. But I guess that will bring that to a close. Thank you very much for joining us, Anthony. We're just going to switch over to this slide here. If you want to get in contact with either myself or Anthony, I believe you can scan these. But what we'll do is we'll put them in I'll put a link specifically to Anthony's profile in the chat afterwards, because unfortunately, due to a LinkedIn bug, I couldn't add him as a co-presenter, which was a little bit frustrating, shall we say. Thank you so much, Anthony. It's been really, really interesting to talk. I think there's far more to talk about. Maybe there'll be a new one in the new year.
Yeah. There'll be definitely a new vulnerability tomorrow.
Absolutely. Well, from our point of view, this is a series. We've got a couple more dates coming up. One around assets, which of course, asset management is everyone's favourite thing, and also potentially ransomware, which would be really interesting for January. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and hopefully hear from you soon. And of course, if you have any questions about SBOMs, vulnerability management, how perhaps you can cut your vulnerability workload down by maybe down to 10 or 5% of what it was originally, please do get in touch.
Thank you very much.
Right, we have ended.